Welcome to the debate. Today, we're asking a pretty terrifying question. What if a two-sentence networking message on LinkedIn required the exact same level of rigorous auditing as, an SEC financial filing?
Which sounds absurd on its face, right?
It does, but we are examining the necessity and application of the rendering review in professional communications. This is a framework drawn directly from the living professional record, specifically LPR Academy Module 8.
Yeah, Clip 7 to be exact.
Exactly. And the governance covering this source-to-surface discipline establishes a highly specific mandate. Every single professional rendering must undergo a strict 12-point review before use.
Right.
The standard is unequivocal here. This audit is, quote, not optional.
Not optional for anything, whether a professional is crafting a dense, high-stakes resume summary for an executive position or just typing a quick transient text message to a mutual contact asking for an instruction.
Yep.
The central disagreement we are exploring today is whether this rigid, universal mandate is the ultimate safeguard for professional truth or, and this is where I land, if it is an overly bureaucratic bottleneck that fundamentally misunderstands how human beings actually communicate in the real world.
Well, I will be arguing that this non-negotiable 12-question audit is the essential firewall. It prevents professional misrepresentation and AI-induced semantic drift. Without it, the entire professional record completely collapses under the weight of modern exaggeration.
Then I will argue that applying this exhaustive checklist to every single rendering is practically impossible at the scale of modern communication.
I mean, it's rigorous, sure.
It's beyond rigorous. Enforcing it universally risks paralyzing organic professional interaction, causing candidates to default to generic safety just to survive the audit process.
To begin, we have to ground ourselves in the core doctrine of this framework, which is that rendering is governed selection, not invention.
Right. The surface is not the source.
Precisely. When a professional takes a complex, factual piece of evidence from their governed historical record and compresses it for a public audience, creating a rendering, the risk of distortion is immense. The 12 specific questions outlined in the rendering review are a mandatory pre-flight checklist.
But a 12-point checklist for everything?
Yes, because the review forces the professional to pause and ask fundamental structural questions, like what source entry does this come from? Is the ownership verb accurate? Is the measure supported? Is privacy protected?
Sure, those are good questions to ask for a resume.
They're necessary for all services. If we do not treat this review as strictly non-negotiable, the temptation to inflate metrics or, lean on generic professional jargon becomes overwhelming. The firewall must be absolute, or it simply isn't a firewall at all.
I come at it from a different way. I mean, the goal of source accountability is sound. Absolutely. But the blanket application of a 12-point audit to every single rendering fundamentally ignores the velocity of real-world interaction.
How so?
Well, the framework explicitly classifies networking and referral messages as renderings, right? Think about the physical reality of that. If a professional wants to send a simple two-sentence referral message, this mandate dictates they must formally pause and ask themselves, what context was left out, or can the client defend this in conversation?
Which they should be able to do.
Yes, but forcing a human being to run that intense cognitive gauntlet before hitting send on a basic networking ping creates a bureaucratic chokehold. Treating this as universally not optional fails to distinguish between high-stakes compression, like a formal resume submitted to an ATS, and low-stakes transient interactions. It represents a massive failure of proportionality.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on proportionality and friction. Let's look at the specific mechanics of this checklist. Think of it exactly like a financial audit.
Okay.
You wouldn't skip verifying the numbers on a balance sheet just because the math is tedious or because the transaction was only for $50, right? In professional communication, the friction is the point.
But wait.
Let me finish.
When the review demands you ask, is the ownership verb accurate and is the measure supported? It is directly targeting the most common and often disastrous mechanisms of professional self-destruction.
But financial audits have materiality thresholds. You don't audit a $50 expense with the exact same scrutiny as a $50 million merger because the financial stakes are different. But in professional truth, a $50 lie is still a lie. Let's walk through a scenario. A client is typing a quick LinkedIn message and casually wants to write that they led a strategic onboarding transformation.
Sounds great on a profile.
It sounds great, yes. But if they trace it back to the source entry, the governed record actually shows they merely supported it by maintaining a weekly tracker. Or perhaps they invent a fake percentage claiming a 30% increase in efficiency because they feel insecure about their qualitative value and think a number looks better.
Which is a huge problem, I agree.
Right. And the 12-point review forces them to confront the mechanics of truth before the lie ever reaches the surface. It stops the casual inflation dead in its tracks.
Precision with ownership verbs and measures is vital. I am not disputing that. The framework itself draws a brilliant line between a measure of performance, like maintaining a tracker or training 6 cohorts, and a measure of effectiveness, which proves what actually changed in the business.
Exactly. We obviously don't want people inventing numbers for effectiveness.
We don't. However, my issue is with the universal mandate. The framework defines this review as a, quote, surface-level audit before use. That inherently contradicts itself, doesn't it?
How is that a contradiction?
If it is merely service level, why does it require tracing every single claim back to the source entry every single time a rendering is slightly adjusted?
Because without the trace, you have absolutely no proof the surface is accurate.
But consider the practical application. Imagine a live interview scenario. Interviewing is what the framework calls rehydration. You are taking a compressed claim from a resume and expanding it in real time.
Right.
Are we really expecting a candidate to mentally run a 12-point checklist, checking for source entries, assessing privacy boundaries, and evaluating omitted context while they are actively answering a follow-up question on the fly? Strict adherence to this universal mandate demands an impossible cognitive load. It prevents professionals from making rapid, necessary conversational adjustments in the real world.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The interview rehydration process is exactly why the rendering review must be done meticulously beforehand.
Beforehand?
Yes. One of the 12 questions specifically asks, can the client defend this in conversation? That question is the bridge between the compressed resume and the live interview. If you haven't run the audit when building the rendering, you put yourself in a position where you cannot defend it when you're asked to rehydrate it live.
I mean, theoretically, yes.
But let's look at why this strictness is so universally necessary today. The catalyst that makes this rigid firewall non-negotiable is the integration of artificial intelligence in drafting professional surfaces.
AI hallucination is a problem, certainly.
It is the defining problem of modern professional communication. The checklist specifically targets this mechanism with 2 vital questions. Did AI contribute? And was AI output reviewed?
Which are great questions to ask.
We know exactly how large language models function. They operate on predictive text, defaulting to generic professionalism. They hallucinate metrics to fill structural gaps. If you feed an AI a source entry that simply says maintained weekly tracker, the algorithm will absolutely try to rewrite it as spearheaded enterprise-wide strategic transformation.
It will, yeah. AI loves to inflate things.
Because AI hallucination and semantic drift are so pervasive, and because the temptation to let AI write our networking messages is so high, this rigid 12-point review is literally the only structural defense we have to keep the professional surface tethered to reality.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. I completely recognize that AI is a massive threat to source accountability, but the structural logic of applying this 12-point audit to every rendering is fundamentally flawed.
In what way?
Think about the human behavioral response to overregulation. If a professional manually drafts a LinkedIn About section entirely on their own, applying those AI-specific questions, did AI contribute, and was AI output reviewed, becomes a purely ritualistic exercise. It is literal box checking.
Well, if they didn't use AI, it's a very fast box to check.
But when you force people into bureaucratic box checking, they stop engaging with the actual spirit of the governance. They go on autopilot.
They shouldn't go on autopilot if they value their professional integrity.
But human psychology dictates that they will. The framework explicitly warns against letting one rendering become the source. It tells us that different audiences need different renderings. A technical recruiter needs a different surface than a hiring manager, right?
Correct.
But if you make the review process this complex and painful, you inadvertently incentivize clients to just use one approved, stale resume for absolutely everything. They will blast the exact same rendering to a recruiter, a hiring manager, and a casual networking contact simply because they refuse to endure the 12-point rendering review again to create a tailored version.
You think the friction causes stagnation?
The heavy friction you're praising actually creates the exact stagnation the system is trying to avoid. The mechanism guarantees the failure of the objective.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you're assuming the friction of the 12 points outweighs the psychological security it provides. You are viewing the audit as a punishment rather than an empowering mechanism.
Empowering?
Yes. Let's look at the final and perhaps most important question on the audit. Does the rendering avoid generic professionalism, overclaiming, and underclaiming?
People focus entirely on overclaiming, but underclaiming is a massive issue.
Exactly. We spend so much time worrying about people inflating their verbs, but underclaiming is just as dangerous. A client might have done incredibly complex, valuable work in a highly regulated environment.
Right.
But because they are afraid of violating privacy boundaries or because they don't know how to articulate their value, they flatten their experience into something entirely generic. The checklist pushes back on that mechanism. It forces the professional to look at the concrete evidence of their value, ensuring their claims are fully supported by the governed record.
I see what you're saying, but
By running the audit, they aren't just checking boxes. They are building unshakable confidence in their own professional narrative. They know their rendering is highly defensible, which empowers them to communicate more boldly, not less. The audit cures the underclaiming.
that's a compelling argument. But have you considered the cognitive load this places on the individual? You're assuming the user experiences the audit as empowering. I argue they experience it as exhausting, and exhaustion dictates behavior.
How so?
Imagine a professional who has 15 minutes at the end of the day to reach out to their network. If that client knows that every single bullet point, every portfolio summary, and every quick promotional statement must run this gauntlet of 12 intense questions, their behavioral response will be to default to the path of least resistance.
Which means they will do the audit to ensure it's safe.
No, it means they will intentionally underclaim by choosing the safest, most boring, most generic language possible simply to pass the audit quickly without triggering a complex mental review of privacy boundaries and source entries. Or worse, they just won't send the message at all.
So you think the governance kills the communication?
Yes, if you make the standard for an acceptable rendering too structurally demanding, you inadvertently flatten the client into the exact generic professionalism the framework is so desperate to avoid. You get compliance, but you lose nuance, personality, and the organic flow of human connection that makes a referral message actually work.
I think we have to look closely at what this system actually defines as generic professionalism. The framework highlights how empty corporate language functions. Take a classic bad summary. Results-driven professional with a proven track record of strategic leadership and cross-functional excellence.
Right, which means absolutely nothing.
It is generic because it is completely untethered from evidence. It's a slogan. Now look at a properly audited alternative. Operations and documentation professional with experience turning scattered processes into clear tools, handoffs, and team references.
Much better.
That is highly specific. The rendering review is the mechanical translation layer that forces the professional to move from the former to the latter. The 12 points aren't there to strip away personality. They are there to strip away the slogans.
But does it take 12 points to do that?
When the review asks what context is included and what context was left out, it is demanding that the professional make intentional choices about what matters to a specific audience. A recruiter needs quick relevance, an interviewer needs a story. You cannot make those granular, audience-specific choices without a rigorous framework. Without asking those 12 questions, the professional is just guessing at what context is appropriate.
But let's look at your own example. You just highlighted the necessity of tailoring for different audiences, the recruiter versus the interviewer.
Right.
The doctrine explicitly states that different renderings can be truthful when they come from the same governed source. It advocates for having multiple versions of the truth tailored for different purposes. Now imagine a professional actively managing a modern career transition.
Okay.
They need a resume rendering, a LinkedIn rendering, a public safe portfolio rendering, and highly specific interview rehydration notes. If they have to apply a 12-point checklist to every single variation of a claim across all these surfaces, the administrative burden becomes astronomical. We aren't just talking about auditing a document once. We are talking about auditing every micro-iteration of a professional identity.
Because every micro iteration carries the risk of a macro disaster.
But let's bring this back to the inclusion of networking and referral messages. We both agree a highly specific message is superior to a lazy one. But demanding a formal 12-point audit, including questions about AI provenance and measure support, just to send a LinkedIn message to a former colleague asking for an introduction?
Yes, even then.
That is where the system crosses from rigorous governance into theoretical absurdity. It treats a casual conversation with the exact same regulatory severity as a sworn affidavit.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on why that casual conversation requires regulatory severity. The concept of trust density is vital here. A referral is fundamentally a human rendering of trust.
True.
When you send that networking message on LinkedIn, you're asking another human being to carry your professional claim to a third party. Let's trace the mechanics of a failure here. Suppose you send a quick, unaudited message to a former colleague saying, I drove a 40% increase in revenue. You didn't check the ownership verb, you didn't verify the measure. The colleague forwards that message to a vice president of sales.
And now that unaudited claim is in the hands of the decision maker.
Exactly. That forwarded message suddenly becomes the primary interpretive lens for your entire candidacy. If the background check later reveals you are merely part of a 10-person team that collectively hit that 40% number, you haven't just destroyed your own candidacy.
You've burned the colleague.
You have compromised the social capital of the person who referred you. The reason the 12-point rendering review is universally non-optional is that there is no such thing as a low-stakes professional rendering once it leaves your control. If that 2-sentence message wasn't audited for truth, privacy, and source backing, the entire foundation is compromised before the formal resume is even reviewed. The review ensures that every single packet of information, no matter how small, is structurally sound enough to travel.
That argument assumes human beings process trust through structural perfection, which we simply don't. We process trust through relationship and contextual understanding. If I refer a colleague, my trust isn't based on whether they used the optimal ownership verb in their casual email to me. It's based on my historical, lived experience with their work over years.
But human memory is fallible. Your lived experience with their work might be clouded by personal affection. The structural perfection protects both of you.
Let's address the privacy aspect of the checklist to illustrate why context matters more than universal structure. The audit asks, is privacy protected? We know the classic example, a client working on a confidential healthcare implementation.
Yes, a very common scenario.
Public safe rendering for LinkedIn absolutely must remove the client name, the patient data, and the proprietary systems. That level of auditing is vital for a public profile. But applying that exact same strict privacy audit to a private one-on-one referral message sent to an internal recruiter at a cleared defense contractor, the context dictates the necessary level of friction. A universal, non-optional mandate refuses to acknowledge that the specific environment dictates the required level of governance. It treats every room as if it's broadcasting to the entire internet.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. The environment doesn't dictate the governance. The governance exists precisely so the professional doesn't make a disastrous misjudgment about the environment.
How so?
You mentioned the defense contractor scenario. That is exactly where the 12-point review saves careers. A professional might assume a private message to a recruiter is safe and accidentally expose protected metadata or confidential outcomes because they didn't explicitly pause to ask question 8. Is privacy protected?
But a professional with clearance already knows the rules of their environment.
The universal mandate exists because human judgment regarding the safety of an environment is inherently flawed. We get comfortable, we get rushed, we get desperate for a job, and we overclaim our metrics or we overexpose confidential details to prove our worth.
I mean, that does happen.
The rendering review is defined as the surface-level audit before use because it acts as the final circuit breaker. It is the moment the professional steps out of their subjective, desperate desires and submits to the objective reality of their historical record. Yes, it takes time. Yes, it requires discipline. But the alternative is professional surface amnesia, where we forget what is actually true in the source record and start believing the polished AI-generated versions of ourselves.
I absolutely recognize the danger of professional surface amnesia. The concept of utilizing a rendering bank where all these audited surfaces are stored with their revision notes and feedback is an incredibly powerful mechanism for maintaining historical truth over a decade-long career.
It really is.
My contention remains laser-focused on the absolute inflexibility of the application.
You want a loophole for convenience.
I want a system that humans can actually use without burning out. The core doctrine dictates that we must never treat the resume as the record itself. The resume is just one rendering. But by demanding that the creation of every single rendering requires manually tracing back to the source, verifying evidence, checking AI logs, and assessing market context, you are effectively forcing the professional to interact with every quick message as if they were rebuilding the entire record from scratch.
It's not rebuilding, it's verifying.
It is exhausting. I would argue for a tiered system based on the mechanics of the interaction. High-stakes compressions, like a resume summary or a formal portfolio, absolutely require the rigorous 12-point audit. But rehydrating a claim in an interview or sending a quick referral message requires a simplified, internalized heuristic, not a bureaucratic checklist. The governance should serve the communication. The communication should not be subservient to the governance. But if you internalize a simplified heuristic, you rely on human memory and in-the-moment judgment, which this entire system proves is highly fallible. The 12-point rendering review is the only mechanical way to ensure that the professional surface remains irrevocably tethered to the source truth. It protects us from our own psychology. It protects us from the very real threat of AI hallucination. Without treating it as a non-negotiable firewall, we invite semantic drift into our careers.
And while preventing that drift is paramount, treating this checklist as an inflexible universal mandate for every single communication risks paralyzing the professional entirely. It creates a system where people either default to generic safety to avoid the massive cognitive load, or they simply ignore the governance entirely because it's too heavy to carry in everyday human interactions. When governance becomes too heavy, people stop complying.
It seems we've reached a point where we clearly understand the mechanics of this governance even as we diverge significantly on its practical application. To summarize, my position is that the 12-question rendering review must remain a vital, non-optional mechanism.
Right.
It is the ultimate firewall that keeps the professional surface accountable to the historical truth. Whether it's a formal resume, a live interview answer, or a transient networking message, the checklist forces a deliberate pause. It demands verification of evidence. It prevents the inflation of verbs and measures. It establishes vital privacy boundaries, and it provides the only structural defense against the generic, hallucinated outputs of artificial intelligence. It is the only way to protect professional truth.
And my summary is that while the 12-point checklist provides an exceptional, rigorous framework for high-stakes renderings, treating it as an inflexible, non-optional mandate for every communication is fundamentally impractical. It ignores the scale and velocity of modern professional interaction.
Even if it protects them.
By forcing low-stakes networking messages through the exact same heavy bureaucratic audit as a primary application document, we risk paralyzing professionals. We increase their cognitive load to a breaking point, and ironically drive them toward the very generic professionalism we want to avoid, simply because a generic slogan is easier to push through the audit.
We do find significant convergence, however, on the core principles of source-to-surface discipline. We both firmly agree with the foundational doctrine that the source is not the source, and that rendering is governed selection, not invention.
Absolutely. We also agree that protecting privacy, maintaining the strict accuracy of performance versus effectiveness measures, and defending against the profound threat of AI semantic drift are absolutely paramount in today's professional landscape. Unquestionably, the goal of absolute professional truth is shared. Our continued disagreement lies solely in the practicality of the universal mandate. We are debating whether a rigid governance structure can scale down to casual interactions without breaking the natural nuance of human connection. It's the classic tension between demanding structural integrity and navigating the messy reality of practical execution.
And it reflects a broader tension in how we must manage our identities today. There is much more to explore in this framework regarding how professionals compress and rehydrate their records, and how they navigate building a rendering bank over time. But we will leave it to our listeners to form their own conclusions on how best to audit their professional renderings, and whether they need an absolute firewall or a flexible heuristic.
Exactly. Because ultimately, every professional has to decide how they protect their own truth and how much friction they are willing to endure before that truth hits the surface.
Exactly. Because when you put a claim out into the world, you want to know that what reaches the audience is clear, safe, and exactly what it claims to be. You have to ensure the mechanics of your communication are sound.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate.